When shall I come and behold the face of God? My tears have been my food day and night, while people say to me continually, "Where is your God?"
We're on the unceded traditional territory of the Musqueam, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Squamish First Nations. Howdy, Suanda Cheryl Bearsley, Natlai Westan, Damdanusli. My name is Cheryl Bear, and I'm from the beautiful village of Natlai Westan First Nation, which is located in BC, about an hour and a half west of Prince George. I had an uncle who passed away when I was 4 years old, and then another uncle when I was 5. The second one, my Uncle Norman, it was a very traumatic death. We still don't know what happened, but we lost him in the Notley River and couldn't find him for a few days. He was like everybody's favorite uncle. He would like walk in the room and just light up the room, and probably like one of my mom's best friends, and so she was traumatized. After my Uncle Norman's death, I went back home. One of my friends walked by, a little kindergarten friend, and she's like, "How come you haven't been in school?" And I was like, "Oh, my Uncle Norman died." And then I just was like, and I just felt it all. And then that's when I just broke down. I started crying. I was incapacitated by grief. That sort of describes sort of my next almost probably 30 years of trying to talk about my Uncle Norman, and I couldn't say his name. I would just start to want to talk about him, but my throat would close and I couldn't speak. My eyes would just fill with tears and I would just be overwhelmed. After my Uncle Norman's death, I would wake up in the middle of the night, or I couldn't sleep, and so I'd go sit by my parents' bedroom door and I would listen to them breathing. And my dad, he had maybe a slight sleep apnea, so he would like be breathing and then he would stop, and then I would be like frozen. And then in those moments in my imagination, I would go from that moment to, oh no, he's not waking up, to calling the and people, and then the funeral, and then the graves, just in seconds. And then my dad starts breathing again, and then it kind of snores a little bit, and then I start just crying and bawling. And I think that kind of trauma just sort of like, it sticks, right?
One of the things that I learned from the therapy community is that the things that we're anxious of are about the future, and the things that we're afraid of tell us about what we've already been through in the past. We learn to be afraid because we experienced danger and we didn't have a resolution to that danger. Somehow our brain coded the experience in front of us as being so dangerous and so intolerable that it left our nervous system activation response on. And sometimes that can actually increase the likelihood of anxiety because our brain is working so hard to protect us from other overwhelming dangers and encounters that would feel otherwise intolerable. So for many of us, without an understanding of how trauma impacts the body, we just see the symptoms at the surface. We see a person's overactive fear response, their avoidance, the nightmares, the agitation, the jumpiness, and the perpetual anxiety about all the things that could go wrong in the future. But for those of us who have training in trauma, what we see is that there is a whole context behind why that developed.
One of the first things we learn as counselors or as psychologists in training is how to stop talking, how to let the silence come between you, how to help the person recognize that you're there, that you're tracking with them, to have therapy as an occasion to show how much you care, how present you are with the person. And that is difficult because we all need to manage our own anxiety over, I don't know what to do, I don't know what to say, I'm afraid of messing this person up even further. But silence is never a bad thing to engage with. A caring, attentive silence with somebody can be very healing. I get so many people asking me all the time, how can I help a person who's hurting? Offer friendship, offer connection, offer a sense of not being alone in those difficulties. People always underestimate how much friendship means to people in those circumstances. Just sitting in silence with somebody is super helpful.
I went to a church when I was in my teens, and the idea in that church was, if you are a good Christian, then everything in your life should be good. So you should have a nice house, and a good spouse, and have kids and, money and all that stuff. And nothing should be sort of like wrong or off. There shouldn't be any death or, mayhem. And so I was always like, there's always stuff going on, right? Like even from losing my uncle and then lots of deaths. Their theology was so harmful. It pushed me away from the church for a lot of years. I still really loved God. I still really wanted to know God. I felt like that part of my life was broken. And it wasn't until I met a native couple named Chuck and Julia, and they came up to Prince George to pastor a church. And Julia just loved me. I didn't do anything to deserve her love, and she just loved me. And that place it became a safe space.
There are 5 spiritual practices of companionship. The first is hospitality, and this might look like sharing a meal, starting up a conversation, or just offering a proverbial seat at the table, even inviting someone into a safe and kind space. Those are all beautiful acts of hospitality. The second spiritual practice of companionship is neighboring. That might sound odd, but really it just means looking for and acknowledging the common ground and the humanity that we share with those around us. The third practice is adopting a side-by-side perspective. I like to picture 2 people standing side by side, taking in the scenery together. They don't have identical views because they're standing in different places, and they're able to enjoy their own view while acknowledging the differences in the view of the person next to them and not insisting that one perspective is better or more correct than the other. Another important spiritual practice of companionship is listening. This sounds really simple, but research tells us that it's incredibly meaningful, healing, and empowering when someone is able to share their story and be heard, especially when the listener is gracious and encouraging. Finally, companionship includes accompaniment. When you accompany someone, it reminds them that they're not alone. This might look like offering thoughts and prayers, or it might include tangible support like accompanying a person to medical appointments or meetings.
Where churches are thinking about mental health, they might be thinking very much in terms of what can we offer, how can we support people. In a way, I think that the greatest gift we can give to people is to allow them to give their gifts to us. And I think for people with mental illness, very often one of the things they lose is that sense of what they have to offer. I think if you've learned to live with a mental illness, there are lessons about negotiating the realities of life that we sometimes ignore in the church. There's a kind of realism about faith. If you've been to that place and held on to any sense of faith in a God who loves you and cares for you and values you, I think you have seen particular things about God that the church needs to hear, that can rescue us from kind of trite solutions and shallow theology that are really quite offensive to people who have really suffered. So I think we in the church need to hear the experiences of people living with mental illness.
I do know when you're really afraid or if a traumatic thing happens, suddenly your body reacts, you go into shock or you go into these different things, and then your breathing is affected right away. So you start to breathe very shallow and very quickly. I can be sitting in a chair and I can be having an anxiety thought, and I'm not in any danger. There's nothing traumatic going on, but in my mind, everything's happening. And I'll be sitting there going, and I'm just breathing like something bad had really happened. With anxiety comes this hyper vigilance, this hyper sort of awareness. But I had always sort of, okay, I'm a Christian now, so I'm not supposed to, have all that stuff. In 2011, I ended up in the hospital over the course of about 3 or 4 months, and I went in with chest pains and I couldn't breathe. And being a woman in my 40s, they just rush you right into the back and hook you all up to the heart stuff. And all of those 3 or 4 times they sent me away. They're like, "Ma'am, you're fine, go home." And I was like, no, I don't understand, like I'm dying, like there's something so wrong. And finally, I think on the last visit, the emergency room doctor said, I think you should see your GP and just talk about anxiety. And I was like, no, I don't want that to be in my life. So I go to my GP and I filled out this test. And he's like, yeah, you have anxiety, like high anxiety. I was like, can I please have a heart problem? Because I can't have anxiety because I'm a pastor. It's literally in the Bible, be anxious for nothing. I shouldn't have to, I don't know how to tell people about this. I felt like half of the healing was in the diagnosis. And I thought, okay, I have anxiety. Now what am I going to do about it? So I dove into the internet and started doing all of this reading and Google searches on how to deal with anxiety. And they put me on medication. And so I was on this medication for a couple of years and it leveled me out. And I was like, okay, this is how other people feel. Like, this is amazing. And it was so helpful to me, those couple of years of learning about all of this. And I thought, I want to lean into healing as much as I possibly can. I reached out and I found a really great Indigenous counselor. Counseling, it might have saved me. I went on an outreach team to Saikas, which is First Nations community about a half an hour from Notley, from my reserve. The chief came along. So he said, hey, I'm gonna pick you guys up tomorrow, your team, and I'm gonna show you how I pray. We went driving up the mountain. We got up there and he had a sort of special spot where he had some stones around a fire pit that he had made. He started a fire with the branches of 5 different trees. And he said, you're gonna step over this fire 3 times. And whatever you're carrying, whatever is bothering you that's really heavy, I want you to leave it on the fire. And the smoke that rises up is gonna carry that to the Creator. I thought about my Uncle Norman and then I thought, no, I don't wanna let him go. Like, I wanna hold him close. I don't wanna forget him. But I thought, this is also painful. And so I'm gonna try to, rest this grief here for my Uncle Norman. And so that's what I did. It wasn't until years later that I realized, hey, I can now say my Uncle Norman's name. That's, to me, like a huge mark of healing. And I know I have a lot more healing to go, but man, that really helped me. And I don't like freeze up and I'm not like completely incapacitated by grief anymore.
The kind of society that we have is multicultural. And all of these cultures come with their own traditions, their own ways of healing. And I think it's really important that these cultures are empowered to hold on to that, to use the healing and the insights that come from their own culture in ways that are constructive and creative, so that that voice isn't lost in the midst of that multicultural conversation. That's not to say that we all have to have the same culture and we all have to have the same healing practices, but we do have to respect and recognize that these different modes of healing are available. And what we definitely don't need to say, well, only European understandings of mental health count in the midst of this culture, and only European modes of healing and help count in this culture. And that's just a mistake. And so listening to these different voices is exciting, as long as we give them the space to be their own voices.
I've traveled to over 600 First Nations communities in Canada and the US, but it's actually more than that. I stopped counting, at 600. It's a beautiful feeling to drive onto any First Nations community on traditional territory. I always just kind of feel like I relax a little bit. There's just this sense of, I'm kind of like home free. It's a place where I feel very safe and I feel very welcomed. Our people are really, really good at hospitality. And when you walk into an elder's home, you'll sit down at the kitchen table or wherever, and they'll just get up right away and head into the kitchen. And you're sort of like, hey, I came to visit you. They're gonna feed you. And then you can't say no. You have to be grateful, you have to sit and eat it. And so if you're gonna be visiting a few elders' homes, you really wanna go on an empty stomach. They're so gracious, and that's just the Native way of being.
I think there are 2 helpful ways to think about companionship. On the one hand, it's something that every community can offer, We can all be hospitable, listen well, and accompany others during difficult seasons. These are pretty universal spiritual practices. But I also think it's important to recognize that communities and individuals exist within different contexts and cultures, and they have unique gifts to offer. So that means the way that one community practices hospitality or accompaniment might look very different from the way another community does those things. There is rich diversity in the body of Christ, and that diversity is reflected in our companionship. I think it's a beautiful thing when churches take into consideration their context, their unique cultural and spiritual heritage, their traditions, and they draw upon these resources in their companionship practices.
One thing I think is the gift of time, to just be with somebody and to be a listening ear. Don't be like Job's friends. Don't tell them what they're doing wrong, what they need to fix to be okay. But to give them this sacred space of just really someone who really listens and attends to the person. One of my favorite Old Testament stories is Hagar, and the whole story with Ishmael and how she goes out in the desert and God hears her, God talks to her, but she calls him the God who sees. And I think there's this great power in being seen, being noticed in a positive way. I really think that's probably the primary gift of just recognizing and noticing and treating that person with respect and honor.
My day job is working as the Director of Community Ministry at First United Church. And it's on the downtown east side of Vancouver, which is known as the poorest neighborhood in Canada. There's like streets where there's just like, open drug use and different things. A lot of folks are scared when they come into and they'll lock the doors and roll up the windows, kind of a thing, because it's an overwhelming kind of a neighborhood. Having been here and worked on the downtown east side and lived on the east side of Vancouver for many years, it's like a small town and you get to know a lot of folks, and so it really is a very tight-knit community. There's a lot of brokenness, there's a lot of addiction here. There's a vulnerability and there's an honesty. So nobody, walks around acting like, I've got it all together and I know exactly what I'm doing. And that's really helped me, that genuineness. And it's kind of like, we have nothing to prove here. We all know who we are and where we are. It's helped me to also be that vulnerable about these things.
The church's role is to work with those on the margins of society and the disenfranchised and people experiencing mental health difficulties. The church could, in simple ways and in very pragmatic ways, really be a center for people to come to. It might be somewhere that people actually get help. It may be somewhere that educational courses are run for the wider community. And I think the church should really be equipped to in very simple ways, offer that compassion, the ability to listen, time, respect, and then sending people out to the support that they need. It all boils down to love.
I love doing things organically and letting relationships grow and just trying to be a healing presence to folks. Some of the best friendships of my life have come out of working with folks on the downtown east side. My dream is to have just a low barrier space where people could come in and just get spiritual care and have a spiritually safe place. There's a lot of places that haven't been safe for me, where it's been very shame-filled and all of that. And I really long for a place where people can come in and just be and just feel loved by God.
When shall I come and behold the face of God? My tears have been my food day and night. while people say to me continually, "Where is your God?"